elected councillors on the call today. I know it's tough to run for office, and it's exhausting, and you've got to put yourself out there. So congratulations on that. And I'm just bringing up my my presentation here. I've got a few slides to share. So just to start out, I'm dialing in today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. But the work of our members, and so therefore our work really does take place on several hundred traditional and mostly unceded each of, so really glad. Briefly, as many of you know, BC Nonprofit Housing Association is the provincial umbrella body for the nonprofit housing sector in BC. Nonprofits in BC, there are about 800 nonprofit housing providers right throughout the province in virtually every community in the province. Collectively, they've got about 70,000 homes in the collective portfolio in about 3,000 buildings. And of course, with investment from senior levels of government, that's a number that's steadily growing. I'm just going to touch very briefly on where we're at sort of in the rental housing crisis. This is not going to be unfamiliar to probably anybody in this room, but just provide some useful context, I think, for the conversation. So in September, new data was released from the 2021 census. And so province-wide, we know now that we've got about 250,000 renter households in BC paying more than they can afford on rent, so more than that 30% threshold. Interestingly, it's down from 2016 numbers, which I think a lot of people, myself included, were surprised by. It doesn't seem to really fit the experience of a lot of renters in communities, and particularly low and moderate income renters. One of the things with the 2021 census is it took place, of course, during the pandemic. So in the census, they measure 2021 rents, so what people are paying in 2021 for rent. Now, we did have a rent freeze in that first year of the pandemic, but also using their 2020 incomes. So any payments that they would have received provincially or through the CERB federally would have counted into their 2020 incomes. So particularly for lower income households, there may have been an artificial income boost. So that's important to factor in. The other thing is the numbers on overcrowding in renter households has bumped up by almost 14,000 households. And so what that means is that if there are more people sharing accommodation, who are working individuals, their income is actually higher. So that helps to offset some of the affordability, or not offset, but mask some of the affordability challenges that we may otherwise see in rental housing when we're just looking at census data. The other thing that emerged through the census was that we're losing affordable homes in the private market. So another almost 100,000 units renting below $1,000 per month were lost in British Columbia. So that's province-wide. And when I say lost, those units still exist for the most part, but their rents have increased above that $1,000 threshold, making them further and further out of reach for low and moderate income families and individuals. So that's something that we're particularly attuned to right now. We hadn't factored this into our own strategies that were provincially adopted in 2017. We had sort of assumed a status quo for the existing stock and hadn't anticipated the incredible price escalation of rental homes in the province. And then interestingly, which also puts pressure on the rental market, we're seeing a continued shift away from home ownership. So as home ownership becomes further and further out of reach for first-time buyers, people are staying in rental longer. We first saw that in the 2016 census, when for the first time in 50 years, we saw growth in rental tenure outpacing growth in home ownership. And that has continued through to the 2021 census. So more people staying in rental longer really means that we need a robust rental supply to make sure that they're accommodated. Otherwise, people get pushed out of the bottom of the rental market because rental units will go to the highest bidder, essentially. So turning toward solutions, I've got just a couple slides on senior levels of government, and then we'll look specifically at municipal actions that can be taken. So as you all know, there's a national housing strategy that's been in place since late 2017. The programs started to roll out in 2018. And I like to use this slide because it really shows the historical context. So we've got at last count, I think the national housing strategy was priced at about $70 billion. But that's still not returning us to the levels of investment we saw in at the peaks in the 1970s and 1980s. So back during those peak years, almost 1 in every 5 units of any type of housing built in this country was subsidized affordable housing. And we're nowhere near that level. We're at about 2 to 3% now, despite the serious levels of investment we're seeing both nationally and provincially. So we're really calling for a return to 70s and 80s style investments into affordable housing. And then here provincially, we've got a 10-year strategy investing in a pretty broad range of types of affordable housing. The big one, of course, is the Community Housing Fund, but we've got investments into transitional housing, permanent and temporary modular support housing, student housing. So all told, those investments should get us to 30,000 additional units in the community housing sector by about 2027. Now, the challenge here is there is these levels of investment, which truly are historic investments, about $7 billion over 10 years. That's far and away more than has been invested at any point in BC's history. But still, we've got projects that are currently unfunded. So under the last call for proposals in the Community Housing Fund, there were about 13,000 units applied for, and about 2,400 were funded. So we've got at least 11,000 units sitting there waiting for funding. In many cases, municipal approvals in place, zoning's in place, things are ready to go and lined up, but senior levels of government have not stepped in with the funding. So that's frustrating for nonprofits, and it's frustrating for municipalities, many of whom are speeding things through the process only to find funding not available at the end of the day. The other challenge right now, just very briefly, is construction costs have risen over the past several years. Labor costs have risen, and now with the recent increases in interest rates, we're hearing about projects being put on hold, or in some cases even shelved at a time that we can least afford for that to happen. So that's an ongoing conversation with the province currently. So just turning our focus over to nonprofits and the municipal process. My colleague Lillian Chow and I, Lillian's the CEO at Entre Nous Femmes Housing Society here in the Lower Mainland, and I did a paper for the U of T last year that really outlined some of the municipal actions that can be taken and the 3 risk factors that a nonprofit project experiences when they're going into the municipal approvals process. Now, these risks are not different than they are for private sector developers: time, cost, and certainty of approval. But what it means for a nonprofit is any time, which costs money, and any additional costs are taken out of rents at the end of the day. So anything we can do to reduce time and reduce the cost for the nonprofit, we're actually improving the rent profile for the residents who will be moving in once the project has been developed. And then, of course, certainty of approval. A rezoning takes anywhere, depending on the municipality, between 8 months and a year and a half. So there's a time factor there. But in terms of cost, it can be anywhere from $500,000 to well over $1 million. And again, those factor into rents at the end of the day. So anytime we can save those types of costs and have a bit more certainty into the process, that's going to benefit residents at the end of the day. So during this last municipal election, you can find our website at makehousingcentral.ca. There was a database of need and demand studies, so those municipal studies that needed to go forward to the province by spring of this year. There's an interactive database that you can pull reports out of. It's the only database like that exists in the province. And then fact sheets that show what type of housing has been built in your community in recent years, as well as a municipal pledge, similar to the Vancouver Island Leadership Group's pledge, that looked and asked for candidates to make commitments around 5 points. So including affordable housing targets to meet the unique needs of Indigenous people in housing needs reports. In those housing needs reports, which were mandatory by the province, the vast majority did not consider housing needs for Indigenous people in their communities. We're looking to municipalities to streamline municipal permitting and rezoning processes to fast track the development of rental housing with a specific focus on affordable rental, so nonprofit and co-op housing. Waiving development cost charges for nonprofit and co-op housing developments. Contributing public land where possible for those new developments, and then delegating approvals of nonprofit and co-op housing developments that are consistent with OCPs over to municipal staff. We did some polling in the spring. There's really, really broad public support for these 5 components of the pledge. All of these 5 components had about 70%, ranging from 70 to 76% support right across the province. So it was a clear signal to us that citizens and the electorate are really looking to municipal leaders to lead on this file and to take the action needed to create the right conditions for affordable housing. And then just a couple more slides here. I like to use this slide, and we've got some more examples if you're interested in following up. This is a project in Langford developed by Macola Development Services. And it really shows the impact of funding on rents at the end of the day. So break-even rents, so no funding available on this project, which was built out in early 2018, I think residents were moving in. So $1,900 a month were the break-even rents. Federal and provincial contributions came in, and there's no question that's the biggest impact, is that funding from senior levels of government brought rents down to $1,050 a month. So all of a sudden that's affordable to a household income of $42,000, which is about the median renter household income in BC. And then the municipality, so Langford stepped in with property tax exemptions, a contribution from their affordable housing fund, and waiving development cost charges for both the residential and the office space. And with those contributions, reduced rents by another $70 per month per unit. So every resident in that building is paying a lower rent because of those municipal contributions. So it really does have those actions really do have a direct impact. And then just finally, a couple of slides here, just really want to underscore the mission drive of the nonprofit housing sector. So every nonprofit in the province, all 800 of those, have a mission drive toward affordability. In new buildings, we always like to say rents are never affordable, never as affordable on day one as we want to see them, but that affordability profile really does improve over time. So this is an example actually of an acquisition. So this is our Arbutus Court in Kitsilano. Built in the 1960s, 3-story wood frame construction, 21 units, 21 one-bedroom units. It was acquired by Brightside Community Homes Foundation. The rents at that time in 2005 were about $750 a month. It was a market rental. And the nonprofit purchased that building, completed retrofits on that building. And when we checked in with them last year to see what the rent profile there was, it's now a rent geared to income building with no subsidy from senior levels of government, no operating subsidy. And they've turned it into a rent geared to income building. So the lowest rent is $475 a month, and the highest rent is $1,367. But nobody pays more than 30% of their income. If this had stayed in the private market, rents would be in the range of about $1,500 a month right now per unit. And so that really does speak to the mission drive when we're taking profit out of the equation and out of the balance sheet. We're able to achieve and sustain really affordable rents, and in some cases improve on those that affordability over time. So thank you. That was it for me today, and I'll hand things back to Diana to lead us through a conversation.
Thank you, Jill. There was so much to cover there. I'm sure the panel is looking at that and thinking, wow, we've got so many topics to touch on. So before I open up to comments, people can certainly provide comments or questions in the chat. And we've got our team at the Planning Council monitoring the chat, and we can bring those into the conversation at any time. So just let us know. But we're going to jump right now to the panel. I don't know if any of you wanted to kind of jump off of what Jill had said already with how this links into the region specifically. Does anybody want to go first there? I'll pass it to Corinne.
Okay, so I think Jill covered an awful lot in a very short space of time. It was amazing. Well done, Jill. I think just when it comes to the role of municipal government, as Jill mentioned, the majority of funding that we get to build affordable homes comes from either the province or from the federal government through CMHC. So the role of the municipal government can really be to ease our access to that funding. So if you think, for example, right now, as of the beginning of December, we can apply for funding through CMHC for the Rapid Housing Initiative. And Rapid Housing is precisely that. The expectation is that we'll have that housing built within 18 months. If you think about, however, your municipal processes as they exist right now, and you factor in the fact that it'll take us at least 6 months to get a building permit for that, assuming that we've already got our development permit and our rezoning in place. So 6 months for a building permit, that leaves us a year to actually construct. So, and that's simply not feasible. So my point is that seems to me a fundamental role that municipal governments can play, is helping us access funding by doing precisely what Jill's been talking about in terms of conserving time and costs.
Kathy, do you want to jump in on that?
Yes, I would certainly echo that time is the biggest thing that municipalities can save us. The processes, you know, to go through rezoning to do all of those pieces just take way too long. And so, you know, we in fact have a project right now that needs a rezoning. It's already a project that exists, but it's not the right purpose. And so, you know, we could certainly access that rapid housing fund to help us with that. But, you know, I anticipate that the rezoning itself will make that impossible, even though, you know, there's only some really minor renovations that would be needed to make this project feasible in the long run. So that time piece is just absolutely critical. And, you know, the timing is exacerbated in many municipalities by the many different departments that projects have to go through. So it's not just the planning department, it's the parks department, it's the transportation department. And these departments traditionally have had challenges speaking with each other. So, you know, any way that that process can be expedited within municipalities really makes a huge difference.
Carolina, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Obviously, I agree with the timing is a huge issue. And I just wanted to add that in addition to the timing, some of the costs that municipalities add on can also make the projects less affordable in the end, especially right now that we're in the current climate that we're experiencing, where it's not just the time, it's also the costs brought on by the municipalities, in addition to the inflation that we're seeing in the higher interest rates. So, for example, we recently accessed a housing grant from the city of Victoria, which comes out to about $500,000, and that is bringing down $500,000 of essentially municipal costs for off-service requirements, utilities, and municipal connection fees. That's huge. $500,000 is going to make a significant dent. Another piece that when we're talking about not just construction, but making new housing affordable and remain affordable once it's operating, the property taxes are a huge number. They can be 200, for some of the new buildings that are going up, they're over near $250,000 a year. Again, that's money that's not going into affordability. And the bigger challenge we're looking at now is that it's competing with higher interest rates. So whereas before we could purchase buildings like the one that Jill gave as an example, which I'm very familiar of, with that over time, the affordability it starts really increasing. Right now, we've got a new building built, and then all of a sudden, we would have budgeted for a 3% mortgage, and it comes in at 4%. So that's you know, $2-3 million extra in a mortgage that we hadn't expected to pay. On top of that, we've got property taxes, and so we're in this really strange situation where the buildings are coming in requiring higher rents than originally planned, even though they're planned with being very conservative. And so there is a lot the municipalities can do to support not just getting these built quickly in an affordable way, but then remove some of those additional costs that are then compromising rent levels.
Thank you. Corinne, I think you might have some things you can speak to around that challenge of different departments and sort of some of them even conflicting when you're asked to do one thing by one department and something else by another that might even not be in contradiction to each other. Is some of those challenges around that something that you think could be addressed in at the municipal level?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, each department has its own mandate. So parks is all about parks, transportation, all about transportation. And as Carolina said, or Kathy, I can't remember which, that doesn't necessarily jive with the planning department's priority or with the overall political direction that councillors have of easing affordable housing. So one of the calls to action that we have put out during the election campaign was the idea of a housing centre. And obviously that would depend on the municipality and the size of the municipality. So it might be one person or it might be a couple of people. but that a housing center that is able to put the affordable housing lens and to infuse the affordable housing lens through all municipal government departments and decisions. And so I think that would really help us in terms of, if we're talking about affordable housing being a crisis, we need to treat it as such. And that needs to be the overriding lens that every decision in every department uses. And we can't expect an overnight transition to that. And therefore, it really needs somebody within municipal government who's pushing that agenda relentlessly forward with all the departments and in all conversations. So that if we submit applications, whether it's for a development permit, whether it's for rezoning, whatever that might be, we're then bringing together every single department that touches that application in an initial response, rather than having separate meetings with separate officials who are all telling us different things that sometimes make you feel like you're slightly losing your mind.
Do either of you, Kathy or Carolina, even Jill, is there some low-hanging fruit around being able to do that streamlining? A housing center might be one of them. Are there other ways to sort of streamline that process that's causing the time delay, which in these days of interest rates is straight up cost?
Well, certainly, I think in Victoria, we have an accelerated process if a nonprofit housing provider is involved, where if your project meets the official community plan guidelines, then you don't have to go forward to a rezoning. It could be handled by staff, and so that greatly reduces the time needed to get a project going forward to fruition, and something that I think all municipalities could adopt.
What are you doing? It's a
Carolina?
affordable housing.
Yeah, so leading up to the municipal election, our group had put out a few solutions, such as the housing center that Corinne talked about, unlocking land, accelerating the processes, and implementing financial exemptions. But I think the overarching spirit of this is promoting collaboration. And that housing center, which doesn't require a lot of infrastructure, it's basically just acknowledging that there's one individual or department that's going to coordinate all of the different aspects that go into building new housing. It will really help us problem solve together. Because whether it's at the very beginning of the process or in one of our projects that had a sewage issue once it was done and delayed some other things, if we could have just had that sort of housing center, someone to talk to and sit down together and say, okay, how can we solve this quickly? That would have cut down time. And I think that's what we're missing, because we all want the same thing, but it's fragmented throughout the process. So that would be probably the top thing that I would say would start all of the changes, because then we'd look at the lenses, what financial exemptions would work, what processes can be streamlined, and everybody would be more on the same page.
It sounds so easy. There's some great, and maybe it is. There's some material coming in from the chat that I'd like to jump to. Leo asked the question, at the municipal level, there could be delays in rezoning, in permitting. What's more important, zoning reform or permitting reform, or does it depend on the municipality?
I'm happy to chime in on that one,
Sure.
and
Great.
we might all have different perspectives, in which case I will defer to the providers on this call, because they've actually got experience moving projects through. My experience is all theoretical. Zoning reform is absolutely critical when we look at the land use in most of our municipalities, including urban municipalities. The vast majority of land is still reserved for single family housing. And I know Victoria's been through this process with the missing middle process, looking at zoning reform. Similar conversations in Vancouver have happened. But once that zoning reform is in place, so many opportunities can open up if a municipality ensures to refresh the OCP regularly, so zoning reform is part of that, and then delegates to staff any project approval where it's consistent with the OCP. To me, not to say that streamlining processes would not also be very useful, but if you do both of those in tandem, so first start with the zoning reform and then streamline, we'll see a lot more, not just nonprofit housing being developed, but more missing middle housing. And there's this very strong relationship between what happens in the home ownership housing market and what's happening in the rental market, and what's happening to lower income renters as a result of those increasing pressures, as I touched upon.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that one? The zoning versus. Go
Just
ahead,
that
Karen.
I think I agree with Joe, because they're complementary, but they're different things. The zoning is what is probably bringing the highest risk as to whether a project can get built or not, because it's a very long, protracted, expensive, and uncertain process in itself. Whereas the permitting process, in my mind, would be a bit easier to iron out once there's agreement on what can get built at what speed. So that's how I would tend to look at it.
So that one in those three things that were mentioned early on, which was time, cost, and certainty of approval, then that zoning piece would really be tied to that certainty of approval factor. And then the permitting more to the cost and time pieces.
Yeah, and just related to that is the fact that so often your funding is also tied to your rezoning. And so, you know, those two things often don't mesh in terms of when they need to happen, because funding calls often come out and they're time limited, and you know, you have to be ready to meet them. And so if the rezoning takes too long, then you're lost until another funding call happens. So it's really critical.
And we saw how those funding, how that funding links to the cost of those units for the end renters. So that that is a big factor for the actual affordability piece. Now there's a question by somebody else in the chat. I believe Jeremy asked, are you ever able to pursue without rezoning? So I guess this is that question of, to what extent is every project you guys pursue a rezoning project versus how many actually fit within existing zoning?
I can speak to that one because we recently did a complete portfolio review to see what could be done and what would be low-hanging fruit. And we actually identified a site in Nanaimo. And then actually the residents were notified at the time, and we're really excited to think of getting new homes. And it would be higher density because they're currently, I think there's like 14 townhomes on a site that could house about 80 units, including family units. Wouldn't require rezoning. There's already a precedent in the area, but we didn't get CHF funding because that CHF funding was, as Jill said, there were so many projects ready to go. And I think what the municipalities can do is express to the provincial government that you want this housing, and that will really support our projects in getting that funding support. And perhaps that was learning for us as well. We had spoken to the municipality in Nanaimo, and they, you know, it really fit in every way. Their request made perfect sense for the project, and then we just never got to the next level. So it's not shelved yet, but I think that's what a municipality could do. And there's so much need, particularly for family housing, that I think together nonprofits and municipalities can really help those materialize and get that funding from the different levels of government that municipalities can't come up with. I mean, that's a reality. That's not their role. It's that supportive role that would make a huge difference.
Yeah, and it seems like where there's a shovel-ready project that fits, like you said, there's precedent, it fits within zoning, it's a super easy place for the municipality to be able to help the partners leverage outside funding. So that's a great place to identify those opportunities where municipalities can perhaps help in with some of those pieces around streamlining the regulatory processes and the approvals in such a way that they can help with making those projects shovel ready in time for the funding. I don't think there's anything else coming out of the chat. Here's another question. There's been a few questions around definitions of affordability, and maybe it's just a quick thing to talk about when you talk about affordable versus geared to income, and we talk about the 30% of income. Is that pre or post-tax income? Can you speak a little bit to how that's calculated, maybe, Jill?
Sure. The affordability threshold of 30% of income going towards rent, it's actually rent plus utilities, and it's pre-tax income.
Thanks. And then there's a question in the chat about if you've got units that are currently housing folks that are majority seniors, but it may not be designated senior housing in those older units, and they're redeveloped and it doesn't prioritize seniors access. How can we make sure that we're protecting housing for seniors in affordable units?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I say that because we're seeing the growth in the need in seniors, and we actually have a seniors lodge in Nanaimo that's not government funded, and the majority of our residents are coming out of homelessness, and our median age is 76. We've got 97-year-olds there, which is wonderful, they're housed. The problem is that we don't have the capacity to house that many. And it's a really good question because there are sites that have to be redeveloped. Price is one thing, but they aren't adequately built to support the needs of seniors who have deteriorating physical and cognitive health just due to age, which we will all have if we're lucky and get to that point. But new developments have to be built, and they do have to take seniors' needs into consideration. And I think a lot of the requirements for design guidelines, at least from for BC Housing, really do go further in addressing those needs. But senior-specific housing is something that needs to be thought of in its own terms. Particularly, what we're seeing at Pacifica is people with complex needs who don't fit into long-term care. They don't fit into supportive housing, and they can't be in independent living because their needs are complex. People are shocked to hear that we have 80-year-olds who have substance use problems around alcohol. It happens. They're humans, even if they're seniors. And they're really, there is no adequate plan for it. So I kind of went on a rant there and didn't offer a lot of solutions. There are some sites there, but it's something that all of us who develop housing need to keep in mind, because the need is simply growing, and it's actually not that hard to have some design that can accommodate seniors. So we just have to keep them at the top of our mind. And Corinne probably has better responses than me because that's what she specializes in.
But it's interesting. No, I don't think it's a better response. I think Carolina really touched on some of the important issues. But so we do housing for seniors at Charm Place that is run by the Gorge View Society. And I think we, in our development, we have a master plan development for our entire 6-acre site, which will look to a mixture of seniors and families moving forward. But the majority of our site will always be seniors. It'll be 80% seniors. And I think that it really is in recognition of the extraordinary need out there that Carolina is talking about. I've been working here for just over a year. And when I first came, we would get calls from 70-year-olds, and we get maybe 3 or 4 calls a week. Now I'd say we're getting probably about 10 calls a week, and the vast majority of them are 80-year-olds. And to Carolina's point, we're hearing from people who are effectively homeless. I mean, they're living in a daughter's tent trailer in her backyard, for example, or on a second cousin's couch. So it's heartbreaking, and I think there needs to be that focus. But I think our funders very much accept that. We see see that in all of the funding criteria, seniors are identified as a priority population. And so I think that we will be encouraged to continue to provide housing for seniors.
There's another comment following on this similar train in the chat and I think this links to what we saw when we were looking at when we did the James Bay seniors research that the Social Planning Council did, that in the older units that are starting to need to be renewed, and Carolina referred to this, that a lot of seniors are in those older units and have been in them for a long time in some deep affordability rents. And so there's been a lot of talk about tenant displacement in the region as we were heading up to the election, and we did some forums on that, but we didn't focus on that tenant displacement. You know, what are the profiles of those tenants that are being displaced, and are they disproportionately seniors in deep affordable units? And if so, how do we put better protection in particularly for seniors?
I don't know if they're disproportionately seniors who are being displaced, but they seem to be the ones having the toughest time relocating, which is not unusual. So it's hard to say. They may be a higher proportion or not, but we know this because on any given day at our downtown outreach center in Victoria, we may have 3 seniors coming in and needing assistance being relocated. And anyway, we've talked about this internally, where maybe we need to talk to private sector developers and try and figure out how we can support them in better doing this process of relocation. Because again, there's some who disagree, but I do think a lot of these sites have to be redeveloped. They're not safe for seniors to start out with, but that process of helping them find more adequate housing is a real, is a gap. Fortunately, many of them are finding their way to our DOS office, and we're able to support them in finding funding like rent supplements and transitioning them. But just the fact that that volume is growing, we can tell that they're just having a lot of trouble relocating, and there's gaps in support there.
Yeah, it would just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, you know, in terms of housing for seniors, that it's more of a provincial federal challenge, because we really only need to look at deep funding for buildings so that we can provide new buildings that meet seniors' needs. And you know, certainly the provincial government can revisit the limits on their SAFER program, because I think those limits are totally inadequate now to meet the new rental rates that are out there. So I think that the challenge is not one that can be addressed in many ways by municipalities. It really is senior levels of government that need to step in here.
I think too, part of the challenge, well, there are a lot of challenges with displacement, but there are a couple of things going on. As Carolina said, in some instances, buildings are at the end of their useful life and need to be redeveloped for accessibility reasons, as well as just cost of maintenance issues. The other thing is, though, we've got within the nonprofit sector a limited land base, right? So where nonprofits already have housing is where they have land. And when new funding becomes available, densifying that land allows a nonprofit to offer more affordable homes. In every case that I've seen, a nonprofit will work diligently to ensure that that people who are displaced during a redevelopment are housed within either that society's portfolio, or they work with other nonprofits to make sure that they can stay in the sector. And then they've got first right of refusal when the new development goes in. But just finally on this issue, which is a bit of a frustration of mine, and it sort of links back to Leo's previous question around land use and zoning reform. If the only place we allow apartment buildings to be in a municipality is where apartment buildings already exist, then we will continue to see displacement. That'll be displacement in the nonprofit sector and in the private sector. And so until we have a real and open conversation and a hard look at how we're using land for residential uses in our communities, this is a problem that's going to exacerbate.
And then what you have is often you've got a more dense area than other areas that's being redeveloped, and you'll have 2 stories of housing replaced with 6. You still only have a net gain of 4, and you lost 2 stories of affordable, as compared to developing somewhere where you don't already have 2 stories of affordable, and you get that full new 6, and you keep the 2, and you're up to 8. So really you move to a net of 4 to a net of 8 affordable stories if you've got that new area development rather than existing density redevelopment. So that is the zoning push that's pushing more risk of displacement that should be addressed for sure. There was somebody in the chat asked, is it time not only for municipal housing center, but also sort of a housing in all policies approach that was kind of talked about in terms of a health in all policies approach in the past? And I think you've alluded to that already, that if there's a way to bring that lens to all of the decisions that are being made, or how does this impact positively or negatively on housing affordability? But is there more that could be done on pushing that lens at the municipal and regional levels?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, it's making it very clear to all the departments again that that's what our priority is. And so you know, I can give an example from the rezoning process that we've just been through at the Gorge View Society. It's frustrating when you're going into a meeting, for example, with parks, who are talking about parks, which as a provider, we certainly can't afford to provide. It's just not within our budget to do that, and would really affect the eventual rents that we'd be charging. But some of the other considerations as well, and you know, obviously trees are very important, and we want to be preserving trees as much as we can. But we also need to be providing homes. And so it's really that sort of disconnect between realities, I think, is what becomes quite difficult to navigate. And so when, you know, as an affordable housing provider, when I'm receiving calls from 80-year-olds who really are at their, you know, at their wits' end and turning up at our doors and thinking if they come in person, then maybe that will appeal to my heartstrings and I'll suddenly be able to find them a home. And then, you know, I'm in an endless discussion about Gary Oak Tree. It's just that sort of, those alternate realities can become a bit confusing. And so I think if again, we're deciding this is our priority, it is our priority. And obviously, you know, the preservation of trees becomes part of the conversation, but everybody's on board with the same idea of this is where we're headed. And to Carolina's point about, you know, collaboration and partnership, we're genuinely working in partnership. I think as an affordable housing provider, one of our sort of primary frustrations is that the municipalities have housing targets, but we're the ones who are actually building the housing. So we're the municipalities' partner in meeting their targets around housing, and we need to be treated as a partner. And that, I think, is the piece that's missing right now, is an acknowledgement of everybody's role in this.
That feels like a good place to sort of sum up. We only have 2 minutes left, so I wanted to give Kathy and Carolina an opportunity to kind of wrap up a little bit if there's anything you want to add to kind of close out.
I guess I will say mine is just super high level, is that, as you said, it sounds so easy. But I think it's more about shifting our mindset to, as Corinne said, this is our priority. And working with municipalities and the other levels of government, how do we make this happen? It doesn't mean that traffic's not important. It doesn't mean that the trees are not important. It means that we've got to build the housing, and how are we going to make it happen in a way that's sustainable, that makes a good community. And I think we often get into our trenches as to what needs to happen or what can't happen, and we need to get past that. and just take a solutions focus. And in order for us to get there as nonprofits, as municipalities, we need to together go to the other levels of government and be really clear on what we need. And I do feel very strongly that that will make a difference. Too often, the housing providers and the municipalities appear to be on different pages. And that is just a way that the provincial or federal government can say, well, that doesn't make sense to invest there. So I do think that we're moving in that direction where I've seen, but we need to really focus on making housing the priority and making everything fall into place around it.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add to that. And you know, I certainly the folks that you talk to on council and who work in the various departments, I think they all want to go in that direction. You know, I don't think there's anyone who's opposed to that. So it's really about just getting those mechanisms in place to make it happen.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to see this conversation continue. I know that this certainly is not the end of it. There's lots of places where there's opportunities for further engagement around both all three of those: time, cost, and certainty. So really great to have you all participate today. Thanks for everybody who joined in this conversation in the chat. We didn't get to everything in the chat, but we covered a surprising amount of it. So thank you so much for the panel. We'll be moving into our AGM next. For those who need to leave, we totally understand. Feel free to bow out. If you do join us, we'll quickly go over a high level sort of overview of what the council's been up to in the previous fiscal and a quick round of board elections. So those who can stay are welcome to. You don't have to be a member. Thanks again to our panel, and we look forward to engaging more around these issues at the Nonprofit Housing Conference next week, right, Jill?
Absolutely. Hope to see a lot of you there. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Diana. Thank everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.